talking Vampires Los Muertos. This is a 2002 movie, which is a sequel from 1998's John Carpenter's The Vampire. Carpenter actually executive producer on this movie. This actually had a third movie as well called Vampires The Turning. Now this one actually has a little bit of vampire cred behind it. It is directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, who directed actually one of my favourite vampire movies, in that being Fright Night 2. And you've got a couple of cast members here who have been in previous vampire movies. Natasha Gregson Wagner was also in the movie Modern Vampires, aka The Revenant. And she's also been in a couple of episodes of Buffy, I believe. You've also got Arlie Jover, who plays our kind of female bad guy vampire here, and she was the female bad guy vampire in the movie Blade with Wesley Snipes as well, the blonde one. And this actually has John Bon Jovi as its star, and a young Diego Luna, who of course would go on to become Cassian Andor in the Star Wars franchise. Now this is a very kind of almost loose remake of the original 1998 vampire movie, or at least the broad strokes are kind of the same. So we have John Bon Jovi's character called Derek, who is a vampire hunter, and he is tasked to get together a group of vampire hunters to seek out, high vampire activity in northern Mexico. Now, when he goes on the kind of the hunt for a team of vampire hunters, he's just finding bodies that have been killed by what looks like vampires. So he ends up recruiting a young Mexican boy played by Diego Luna. You've got a woman who appears to be suffering from vampirism but hasn't fully turned, and she's kind of staving it off with drugs. And we also have a young priest who is a sole survivor of a massacre by vampires in the kind of like the church where he was worshipping. And this kind of like motley crew gang is then later joined by another kind of professional vampire hunter as well. So ultimately you have the vampire hunters versus the vampires. I won't say too much more about the plot. Suffice it to say it involves the vampires, just like the first movie, trying to find a way to existing sunlight. So first of all, let's talk about what works in this movie. So I do think that there are some good story elements here. Despite it being similar in a lot of ways to the original movie, I like the idea here. We have two competing ways of these vampires achieving their goal of being able to walk in the sunlight. We have the kind of the mystical means that involve this kind of this particular kind of crucifix, which I believe was from the first movie as well. And then we have a scientific means by way of these particular sort of drugs that are in this film as well. So it adds a kind of a little bit of a neat story element here, where there's actually kind of two different ways that these vampires can kind of exist in the sunlight. Just like the first movie, although this one to a lesser degree, there are a couple of kind of nice atmospheric kind of moments of cinematography here. The vampires kind of, walking in a kind of washed out kind of shots, and some really nice kind of location shooting, obviously, in this kind of dusty and deserty environment. It does looks pretty good. The movie actually looks like it has a kind of straight to kind of video movie. It actually looks like it has a relatively high production value with some relatively kind of well done kind of gore shots here, and nice kind of production value in the kind of some of the kind of the location shooting and set design, costuming and things like that. The vampires themselves, I think, actually kind of look pretty much consistent with the original movie, and I kind of quite like their kind of look, and I like the idea that these vampires are kind of harder to kill maybe than some of your vampires from other movies, and you have different levels of, from the right at the top, the master vampires, down to kind of ones who have just been turned and therefore a little bit kind of like wet behind the ears about how it all works and things like this. There's some kind of neat vampire slaying equipment on display here, including a Desperado style kind of hidden compartment in John Bon Jovi's surfboard containing a variety of vampire slaying equipment. What doesn't work for me? This movie, as I say, is maybe not a remake, but it's a little bit too similar to the original film in some ways. But it feels like the volume has kind of been dialed down. It's not particularly kind of a thrilling movie. No one ever seems to be particularly high energy in this film. It all seems kind of a little bit low stakes in some ways. I mean, the actual plot of the movie isn't, but it's just the way it's played. It just seems a little bit too kind of low energy. The cast here, I think, aren't particularly good. I don't think anyone really gives a particularly kind of good performance, and that includes Jon Bon Jovi. And the acting here is just not particularly good. Maybe not terrible, it's not embarrassingly bad, but it's just not great, pretty much, unfortunately, across the board, with some quite hammy kind of dialogue and cheesy performances, really kind of hampering this movie. As much as I do like some of the plot elements here, there are some elements that are just plain silly. I won't go too much into plot details, but let me just say one scene, for example. This is kind of demonstrating what I mean. We have a group of vampire hunters who are, you know, obviously on the trail of vampires, and yet they decide to take refuge and all sleep through the night without anyone on kind of watch. And of course, there is vampires present. And it's just like, you're meant to be professional vampire, at least two of you are meant to be professional vampire hunters, and there's no one on watch. And you know, one of them is just kind of sleeping out without any protection, just out in the open. It's just very silly. There's kind of lots of kind of like almost juvenile and kind of basic mistakes that kind of happen on a kind of plot wise and things like that. Ultimately, it's not a terrible film, but I just think it's kind of rehashing elements from the first movie. There are a couple of new elements, like this kind of, as I say, this pharmaceutical idea, which I think is the strongest thing in the movie. But even that, again, I don't want to spoil things for you, but even that I have a few kind of issues with it. It's just a little bit dull, this movie, at the end of the day. I mean, the John Carpenter original film, I do enjoy that movie, but I still think that still has some issues. But this one is just, it's not interesting. The characters aren't dynamic enough. The vampires seem a little bit just kind of not particularly interesting. Either they're not as strong, they don't really have any sort of character. Our kind of lead female vampire doesn't seem, is nowhere as strong as our kind of lead bad guy from the original movie, for example. So ultimately, it's a below average film, although not terrible. I'll give it a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? And which do you prefer at the two vampire sequels, if you've seen them? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.